Ever since China officially announced it would hold a military parade to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the victory in the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and the global anti-fascist war, the event has become a focal point of world attention. However, just as Victory Day approaches, news has broken that Japan is using diplomatic channels to try and stop European and Asian leaders from attending the commemoration. As one of the aggressor nations in World War II, Japan has never truly reckoned with its historical crimes. Instead, it has remained fixated on its status as a defeated nation, obsessed with its fantasy of becoming a normal country. It's no surprise that a Japan like this would object to a Chinese-led event aimed at defending historical truth and promoting a correct understanding of history. But the fact that they would go so far as to officially try to obstruct and boycott it has still exceeded many people's expectations. After all, when China held its first V-Day parade in 2015, Japan's pushback was limited to the media, where it criticized China's choice of a military parade as a form of commemoration. This time around, with a precedent already set, Japan should have been mentally prepared. So why is its reaction so much more intense? In recent years, a phrase has gained traction on the Chinese internet. Japan is anti-defeat, not anti-war. This is an incredibly precise and accurate description of the Japanese government's stance. During World War II, Japan was deeply poisoned by militarism, and its cruelty was so extreme that even its fascist ally, Nazi Germany, was appalled. This cruelty wasn't just directed outward, it was turned inward as well. Japanese troops were ordered to fight to the last man, and even after Germany's surrender, the slogan, "100 million will die for the emperor," was still being shouted. It was only after the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, making Japan's militarist leaders realize that continued resistance wouldn't stop the Allies from holding them accountable, but would only get them killed faster, that they reluctantly accepted the demand for unconditional surrender. Even then, Japan's leadership did everything it could to whitewash its defeat. In the emperor's famous surrender speech, there is not a single mention of aggression, nor any clear admission of defeat or surrender. Instead, it vaguely refers to accepting the provisions of their joint declaration. Given the education levels and media landscape of the time, it's doubtful that most Japanese people even knew what the Potsdam Declaration said. Clearly, Japanese militarism never admitted its wrongdoing. It refused to even accept that it had lost. Originally, the Anti-Fascist Alliance, having learned the lessons of World War I, had agreed that a thorough transformation of the defeated nation's culture and society was necessary to prevent them from becoming a cradle for war again. If this policy had been fully implemented, Japanese militarism might have been eradicated. However, the United States, driven by its Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union, decided it needed to build Japan into an anti-communist bulwark in Asia.
The U.S. had followed through with the original plan. Japan's left-wing forces would have become dominant, which was not in America's interest. So, to save time and effort, the U.S. abandoned the anti-fascist consensus. It chose to protect Japan's militarist elite in exchange for their cooperation, directly using their influence to control the country. As a result, many Japanese war criminals escaped justice and were even able to return to positions of power shortly after the war. Meanwhile, those who genuinely reflected on the war were often suppressed for their left-leaning views. In such an environment, it was impossible for Japan to develop a true sense of remorse. Yet they were fully aware of the crimes they had committed and the hatred their victims felt for them. They lived in fear of future retribution. But a sincere apology to win the forgiveness of the victim nations was something Japan's right wing was both unwilling and unable to do. After all, many of them were war criminals themselves. An apology might lead to new trials. So they chose to obscure and even falsify historical facts, trying to make the world believe their fabricated narrative. The United States, needing to keep its Asian capitalist allies united and not seeing Japan as a real threat, acquiesced to this historical revisionism. This strategy wasn't entirely ineffective. While the direct victims of Japanese aggression were mostly outraged, many others were influenced by Japanese propaganda. For many Southeast Asian nations, life under European colonial rule had been harsh, and life under their own post-independence rulers wasn't much better. So for a long time, many of them accepted, to some degree, the false narrative that Japan had liberated Asia from European colonialism. And while the South Korean public has always resented Japan, its government, heavily influenced by the US, has never dared to be too confrontational. This left China and North Korea as virtually the only victims of Japanese aggression who have steadfastly opposed its attempts to rewrite history. For a long time, Japan wasn't too worried about this. In their eyes, they were the top power in Asia. As long as they weren't facing a united front, there was nothing to fear. But in the 21st century, the power dynamic between China and Japan has reversed. As China's national strength and international influence have grown, it has gradually gained the ability to make its voice heard on major international issues. In 2015, China held its first V-Day parade, a clear sign that it was officially entering the battle for the narrative of World War II. This made Japan deeply uneasy. On one hand, they feared that China's promotion of the historical truth would undo decades of their revisionist efforts and reawaken anti-Japanese sentiment across Asia.
But what terrified them even more was the thought that if China, despite all of Japan's propaganda, had not forgotten its hatred, and had in fact grown even more resentful, what would stop it from seeking revenge one day? At the time, though, while China had surpassed Japan, it was still far behind the United States. Japan could still hide behind America's coattails. Japanese media stirred up fears of a China threat, but their suggestions were mild, proposing a candlelight vigil instead of a parade. The Japanese government declined its own invitation, but did little else, even tacitly allowing a left-wing former prime minister to attend the event in Beijing. In the years that followed, Japan quietly ramped up its spending on propaganda, hoping to distort the historical memory of the world, and especially of China. In 2015, the Japanese Foreign Ministry created a new budget category for strategic information dissemination, the main purpose of which was to cultivate pro-Japanese groups to promote a correct image of Japan to the international community. In the following decade, the budget for this project exceeded 56 billion yen. But just as Japan was starting to feel a bit more secure, it was confronted with a terrifying new reality. China was now the undisputed dominant power in Asia. In 2016, the U.S. tried to halt China's rise by orchestrating the so-called South China Sea arbitration and sending 2 aircraft carrier groups to intimidate Beijing. But when China prepared for a full-scale confrontation, the U.S. backed down. This was a de facto admission that America did not dare to fight a war with China in its own backyard. Since then, China's military has grown even more rapidly. Japan knows this, but it has continued to bury its head in the sand, using the U.S.-Japan alliance to reassure itself that China wouldn't dare attack. But as the trade and tech wars between the U.S. and China have intensified, this self-comfort has worn thin. The war in Ukraine was the final straw. The West made endless promises to Ukraine, encouraging it to reject a peace deal and fight to the death. But when Russia didn't collapse under sanctions as predicted, the West quickly abandoned Ukraine, refusing to step in and help it win the war. Seeing Ukraine's fate, how can Japan possibly continue to believe that America would go to war with China for its sake? So when China once again holds a V-Day parade and in the rehearsals showcases unprecedentedly advanced weaponry, it's easy to imagine the terror in Tokyo. In this state of extreme panic, Japan's actions have become unhinged. They hysterically decry the parade as anti-Japanese, and have even taken the insane step of trying to use official diplomatic channels to stop other countries from attending the event. But Japan needs to understand, historical facts do not change based on anyone's subjective will. any attempt to tamper with the truth will ultimately backfire. If Japan truly wants to turn the page on this chapter of history, the only way is to formally and sincerely reflect on its history of aggression, make a clean break with militarism, apologize to the victim nations, and earn the forgiveness of the international community.